Hello and welcome to today's Schiller Institute webcast for February 27th. I'm Dennis Speed, and we're going to be having a special discussion today, a roundtable, to discuss matters of international import and the role of the United States as a leading power in the world today. Now, Americans find themselves in quite a quandary, an intellectual quandary, in terms of how to even think about how the present American administration and previous administrations have attempted to formulate foreign policy. Some people refer to this as America's grand improvisation. In other words, the tendency to simply lurch from one sort of reaction to another with no clear conception or direction. America's erstwhile ally, Great Britain, and particularly the City of London financial forces, however, always have a plan, always have a policy, always have an agenda. In order to allow patriotic forces from the United States to actually think competently about who the United States is and therefore what the United States' policy ought to be, we begin today with an excerpt from Lyndon LaRouche's 1999 Storm Over Asia, in which he discusses the content, character, and purpose of the United States.
Which was a continuation of the even more evil Babylonian culture before then. There was a revolution in the Eastern Mediterranean, which became called Hellenistic culture. And Hellenistic culture, with all its drawbacks and internal faults and difficulties, was the highest level of culture which European civilization reached, essentially, until about the 15th century, until modern times. Then in about 200 BC, about the time that the Roman soldiers murdered the great Archimedes at Syracuse, the Romans, which in the process of becoming the later Roman Empire, placed an increasingly dominant role in the Mediterranean. The level of culture of European civilization collapsed. The Greek classical tradition was crushed under the brutish heel of Roman and Roman imperial culture, Latin culture. It took a long time for mankind to recover the level of civilization to that which had existed in the Hellenistic period, the period of Aristophanes, the greatest scientist of Egypt, who was also a Greek. Every development in European civilization upward since that time has been based on two things. First of all, the Hellenistic or Greek culture, which was still widespread, though subordinated, in the Middle East, was the culture of the apostles in the time of Christ. There was no Hebrew language spoken at that time. There was a Hebrew written script, but how to pronounce it, what it meant, was somewhat in doubt. You had an Arabic language, Aramaic, which is the predecessor of some of the languages of that area today, and you had Greek. And the cultivated, educated people of that area, including some of Christ's apostles, as you may note, thought and wrote in classical Greek, the classical Greek of Plato. Exemplary is the case of the apostle John. Also exemplary is the case of the apostle Paul with his epistles. So these ideas of the classical Greeks became the foundation upon which Christianity spread its message. The essential contribution of Christianity to this revival of civilization was the principle of Christ that all persons are made equally, man and woman, in the image of the Creator of the universe. And therefore it followed that the acceptable order of society to the Christian was a form of society in which the general welfare was defended and promoted in the sense I've described the general welfare earlier. There was a long struggle to bring this kind of society into being, not because there was any particular plan to build a form of state, but rather there was a commitment to establish relations among people which were consistent with this Christian principle, as the Christian principle made use of Greek culture as a way of propagating its message. The result was eventually the emergence of the first modern nation state, or the first paradigm of a modern nation state in the 15th century in Europe, centered around what is called the Golden Renaissance. Yeah? This led eventually to the formation of the modern nation state. However, for various reasons, only one nation state ever achieved a durable constitutional form consistent with Christian principle, and that was the United States. This is no accident. What had happened is, in the attempt to found a modern nation state, as in France and in England under Henry VII, and by Isabella in Spain, these efforts were crushed by a financier oligarchy based in Venice. Venice, in order to try to prevent European nation states from developing according to the modern model, organized religious wars within Europe. And Europe was torn, as I described earlier, by religious wars up until 1648, and a little bit thereafter, but essentially that. So, as a result of these conditions, no durable form of nation-state republic, constitutional nation-state republic, was ever developed in Europe to the present date. We have a noble experiment in the case of Charles de Gaulle's efforts in the Fifth Republic in France, but as we know, that was destroyed by his successors. Only the United States Constitution represents to this day a form of nation-state republic, which in its Constitution, in its original conception, in its underlying law, and in our best traditions, is consistent with the Christian principle underlying the efforts to form the nation-state during the 15th century. This is not accidental in the sense that we did not create a nation-state on our frontiers. We were not people who took our circumstances and responded to our circumstances and developed a form of society based on these circumstances. Not at all. All of the ideas on which the United States was premised and developed came from Europe directly, including a strong influence directly from Gottfried Leibniz, whose writings were among the most important influences on the United States during the course of the 18th century. The most important influence in shaping what became the Declaration of Independence and our federal Constitution, especially its preamble. So that from the standpoint of Europeans, the United States was their treasure. It was established with the help of Europeans, with the inspiration and backing of Europeans, in order to create in our nation a republic which would serve as a model and rallying point for the creation of similar republics, sovereign republics, throughout the world, especially in Europe. That is our special, exceptional quality as a nation, a quality we have often betrayed. This is the secret of the power of the United States, not as physical power, but the power to influence the world, the power to provide certain contributions to development of a community of principle globally.
So we'd like to point out that according to Lyndon LaRouche, at least, the idea American exceptionalism can only have that meaning. It is not a jingoistic, xenophobic, or ethnically driven conception. It is not an idea of the rugged frontiersman. It's merely an exception to the tragedy of misgovernment that has been characteristic of many, many nations and empires and so on throughout history. But of course, it does require that the United States adhere to that concept of progress, economic and technological progress, scientific progress, which was implicit in particular in the work of Alexander Hamilton as the first Treasury Secretary of the United States, and the 4 works that he wrote at the time, and more importantly had been promulgated and reinforced by Abraham Lincoln, by Franklin Roosevelt, by JFK, and by Lyndon LaRouche himself. That upward impulse of progress and civilization that the United States represented and is sometimes referred to as the American system today has been most in evidence in the nations of the Pacific. And you see it reflected, for example, in the space programs of China, in the space program of the United Arab Emirates, the space program of India, as we see all those space programs, including even the failure, relative failure of the Indian program last year around the issue of Mars, and the dialogue, the dance in the skies above Mars that we see today of civilizations in which the United States is involved. That represents the upward impulse of human civilization. The founder of the Schiller Institute, Helga Sepp-LaRouche, has been involved for decades now in a dialogue on behalf, by the way, of the transatlantic world, including the United States, with particularly the nation of China, but all of the nations of Asia, a dialogue going back into the 1990s and even before that. And what we wish to do today is to try to force, by means of a dialogue of various participants today, a higher understanding by the citizens of the United States and others of in what way the United States can play a positive role in that form of dialogue in the circumstances that the world finds itself in at this moment. And so, without any further introduction, I'd like to have Helga Sepp-LaRouche, and then we'll follow that with the panel of persons that have joined us for today. So, Helga?
Yes, good afternoon. Well, I want to try to look at the 5 weeks of the Biden administration. Where do we stand? And what does it mean for the strategic situation? Now, unfortunately, I have to start with the incident which happened on Thursday night, where the Biden administration made a military strike in the border area between Syria and Iraq on the Syrian side, allegedly hitting back because of an attack on US and coalition forces a little bit earlier in Iraq. And John Kirby told reporters at the Pentagon that this was an Iran-allied militia group, and that President Biden was presented by the Pentagon with a whole array of options how to respond, that he supposedly chose the, quote, middle one, and then the strike occurred. Now, immediately, several legal persons, professors from law schools, like Professor O'Connell from Notre Dame, said that this was illegal because there would have been enough time to bring the case in front of the UN Security Council, which would have been the proper place to deal with that and not have an immediate military response. Then Professor Haig from Rutgers Law School basically also said this was a violation of international law because it was not repelling an ongoing attack. It did not respond to anything ongoing immediately. It took place on the territory of another state, Syria, which was not necessary but just convenient. It was not defensive. And he basically concludes and says this was a message by the Biden administration that President Biden is willing to violate international law as his predecessors. Now, that's not a good start. Well, I have to tell you that neither the Russians nor the Chinese expected a big change in terms of foreign policy coming from Biden as compared to the Trump administration. Not even the Atlanticists in Europe thought that there would be a significant change. They said maybe Biden's tone will be a little bit nicer, but there will be no change in substance. Now, President Biden, in his first foreign policy speech, said, you know, America is back and will reassert its role as an international policeman of sorts. This is now my formulation. And then, however, at the virtual conference of the Munich Security Conference, Biden said also the usual things about Russia and China and the enemy being the enemy. But he said something which was pretty much blocked out by the Western media, but it was picked up by Global Times and the Chinese Foreign Ministry. And because it was a slightly different note, I mention it here. What Biden said is, this is not about pitting the East against the West. This is not about wanting conflict. This is about a future in which all nations can choose freely their path without the threat of violence or coercion. We have to not return to a reflexive opposition and rigid blocks of the Cold War. Now, we will, I mention this because we will hold this up and see how Biden fulfills in his actual policy these promises. So Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, in a conference on disarmament on the 24th of February, said that he communicated with the Secretary of State Blinken that he hopes that with the Biden administration, Russia and the United States can go back to the principle which was agreed between Reagan and Gorbachev in 1985, which was the idea that nuclear war cannot be fought because nobody can win it, and therefore it must be not fought. Now, well, my late husband, Lyndon LaRouche, who was the architect of the Strategic Defense Initiative, had actually provided a way how that could have become actuality by making nuclear weapons obsolete, which, you know, in one sense is the only guarantee that there will be no nuclear war. But the events went as they did. Now, the Russian position represented by Foreign Minister Lavrov also was to say that Russia thinks that the principle of NATO of nuclear sharing is a violation of the non-proliferation treaty, because what it does, it gives all the NATO members the right and duty to have fighter jets ready for the delivery of nuclear weapons, train soldiers to help in the delivery of these nuclear weapons, and that is clearly a violation of the NPT treaty. So Lavrov demands, and he wants to be that part of the upcoming disarmament discussions, which have a potential, because Biden did agree to continue the New START agreement for another 5 years and have other discussions. So what Lavrov asked is that because of this illegal stationing of nuclear weapons in other countries, where the United States actually, of all 9 nuclear powers, is the only one doing that all US nuclear weapons must be brought back to the United States, and that the infrastructure in the other countries for these nuclear weapons be eliminated. Now, I think this is a very good good demand, and we should absolutely make sure that enough people know about this and support it. Now, right now, there are approximately 180 to 200 gravity bombs in Europe. And with the modernization of these weapons, which is going on, this creates actually a much bigger danger than what people know. In the 80s, when you had the SS-20 Pershing II missile systems being, in a few minutes, 3, 4, 5 minutes distance from each other, in a permanent condition of launch on warning, people knew that this meant the risk of the Third World War, and there were hundreds of thousands of people in the streets. Helmut Schmidt at the time talked repeatedly about the danger of a nuclear war. Now, the SDI developed by Lyndon LaRouche was the answer to that. It would have neutralized that danger. And the fact that at that time the Soviet Union rejected it, despite the fact that President Reagan had offered it to the Soviet Union, my husband in '84 made the prediction that if the Soviet Union would stick with their refusal, they would collapse in 5 years. And that's exactly what happened. Now, there was a moment of a potential new beginning. I'll come back to that shortly. But later, with the Obama administration, the United States shifted, or Obama shifted, to the so-called pivot of Asia. Now, there was a new change in the Trump administration, where in December 2017, the National Security Strategy of the United States was published. In January, the National Defense Strategy, January 2018, and in February 2018, the Nuclear Posture Review. All of these being related to the US strategic framework for the Indo-Pacific. Now, that paper remained classified, but very surprisingly, the Trump team, before they left office in January this year, they published it. And it is quite an interesting document. You can read this now. It says the US strategic framework for the Indo-Pacific means that the United States will insist on the strategic primacy in the Indo-Pacific region, promote the liberal economic order, prevent China from establishing a new illiberal spheres of influence, protect the vital interest of the United States in the Indo-Pacific, protect the homeland, advance American prosperity, peace through strength, advance American influence, and keep US access to the most populous area in the world, where 1/3 of all global economy is located. It is the engine for US regional and global growth. And then it continues having a detailed approach how to deal with all the countries in the Indo-Pacific. Now, this paper basically remains there. The policy of the military-industrial complex, which is sort of the continuity between the administrations, no matter who is president, these forces are there. It should have been classified for another 30 years. And obviously, the reason why it was published was to sort of create the environment for the new Biden administration to follow. Now, a very interesting professor, Lyle Goldstein from the US Naval College, I think in Rhode Island, he said that this strategy is a recipe for disaster. And I agree with him that the most dangerous element in this framework is the policy on Taiwan, where Goldstein notes the fact that in previous administrations, there was always what was called strategic ambiguity, where on the one side, it was recognized the one China policy. On the other side, US strategic interests were also formulated, but it was sort of ambiguous. Now, this has shifted to an open deterrence without the slightest gesture, and Goldstein is convinced this could lead to war, and that war could be lost for the United States, and it could lead to the use of nuclear weapons, which would result in an open-ended, result, with the possibility of the great tragedy. Now, this is obviously the danger which is immediately there. Goldstein advises and says the new team would be advised to put this paper on the junk heap and start fresh. Now, this thing is not dormant, but Hans Christensen from the Federation of American Scientists just reported that according to satellite pictures, one can see that this nuclear deterrence is triggering a nuclear arms race with China. These satellite pictures show that there is a massive construction of tunnels and silos for nuclear missiles by the PLA, and it is reflecting the fact that the PLA is not sure that in case of a conflict, that they would have enough time to get their missiles ready, and therefore they are using these tactics in order to keep a credible Chinese deterrence. Now, what is the problem? I mean, obviously, you have a situation where China is engaged, or not engaged, but Chinese policy is, having an incredible effect, because the Belt and Road Initiative is the locomotive for the world economy. China is collaborating with the new Silk Road with 150 nations in the world. And, it is the only country which had an economic growth rate of 2% in 2020, despite the pandemic. Now, overall, if you compare how the West is doing, how China is doing, China was able to lift 850 million of its own people out of poverty. They eradicated extreme poverty, and they are also now reaching out, working with 150 countries, mostly developing countries, helping them to construct infrastructure as a precondition for their own development. They did very well with the pandemic. China had only 4,636 deaths so far, while the United States bypassed the 500,000 mark of people dying. Europe had 839,000 deaths. Now, the US, Canada, and Great Britain have hoarded several times as much of doses of vaccine than they have citizens. And despite the fact that they have some logistical problems in providing these vaccines, nevertheless, they have more vaccines than they need. The EU has even announced an export stop for vaccines, which means that I think 80%, that these rich countries have, I think, 80% of all vaccines worldwide. Now, Russia and China, on the other side, are producing very good vaccines themselves and started to export these to dozens of developing countries. Naturally, they are being immediately accused of conducting vaccine diplomacy after they carried out mask diplomacy. Now, obviously, we are sitting on a powder keg. China will not give up the Belt and Road Initiative. It will not give up its rightful insistence that it will base its economy on innovation, that it will become a modern, prosperous socialist country, that it will cooperate with many other countries. So where is this going to lead to? Is this going to be an inevitable conflict with World War III as the result? Because the Indo-Pacific framework says, going back really to the Dick Cheney policy of 1992, because remember, when the Soviet Union had collapsed, now people say there were no promises given to Russia, but it's not true. You have people like John Matlock and Horst Telschik who were in the negotiations, and they said it was absolutely clear that the promise was given to Gorbachev. NATO would not expand to the borders of Russia. But look where NATO is now. B-1 bombers were just located to Norway, being involved with integrated maneuvers with the Norwegian all along the Russian border. And the situation is really extremely dangerous. You could have an accidental nuclear war if one of the pilots makes a big mistake. Now, the situation then was very quickly shifting in the early 90s to the PNAC policy, the Project for a New American Century, and people like Dick Cheney were the authors of the doctrine, saying the United States will never allow one nation or a group of nations to bypass the United States economically, politically, or militarily. And this is what is now revived in this Indo-Pacific framework. Now, this is not tenable. So the big question, I think, and this probably will come up as a test rather shortly, will this conflict that China insists on its rightful insistence of its own development, being a 5,000-year-old nation with a continuous culture, having been a world leader in technology until the 17th century, will this lead to an inevitable war? Now, that would mean the extinction of the civilization, because I believe that the argument of Ted Postol, that there will be no limited nuclear war because of a fundamental difference between conventional war and a nuclear war, it will in all likelihood to the annihilation of civilization. Now, that is why the Schiller Institute is proposing a different approach. My late husband, Lyndon LaRouche, has been saying for a very long time that because of what we will hear from Mike Robinson and in particular Harley Schlenger, because of the problem of the empire, the British Empire, but more generally the forces of the empire in the world, only if you have the four most important nations, most powerful nations, the United States, Russia, China, and India, working together to change the rules of the game, that there is a way out. Now, that is the question. Beasley from the World Food Programme has been saying again and again, this year there is the danger of 270 million people dying of hunger. This is going on right now. In Yemen, millions of people are on the starvation level. In all of Syria, millions of people are in danger of dying of hunger as a result of the war, of the pandemic, and the economic destruction. Now, is there not another way possible? Cannot the United States work together with Russia, China, and India to rebuild and reconstruct this entire region of Southwest Asia, from Afghanistan to Iraq, Syria, Yemen, into Northern Africa and beyond, and reconstruct that area which has been completely derooted? Now, there is some hope. I think Dennis mentioned in the beginning the Mars mission of the United Arab Emirates. And I can only advise our viewers to watch a beautiful video with the head of the United Arab Emirates Space Agency, Mrs. Sarah Al-Samiri, a young woman of 34 years, who has developed a beautiful vision. And in this video, she not only talks about how they took this Mars mission, and in 6 years were able to transform the entire science orientation of the country. Remember that it's not so long ago that the Emirates had their first refinery. I think it was in 1999. And then, Lyndon LaRouche and I were in the Emirates in 2002. My husband gave a beautiful speech about how not to use the oil for, just money and profit, and not even for fuel, but to use the income from that to invest in water and in innovation. And this video of Mrs. Al-Amiri, she at one point sticks her finger in the air and says, if you look in the sky and think when the Hubble telescope makes a picture of that tiny fraction of the sky, what you will see on this Hubble picture is millions and billions, not of stars, not of planets, but of galaxies. And you will get a sense about the incredible vastness of the universe, where you start to get a totally different sense about who we are as a human species. Now, I think this is showing the way to go. If the United States and China, Russia, and India, all spacefaring nations, would put their efforts together and transform Southwest Asia, which mostly is desert, together with the Sahara and Sahel zone of Africa. You have this desert strip which goes from the Atlantic in African Atlantic all the way to the Saudi Arabian Peninsula, all the way to the northeast of China, a huge strip of desert which is growing. And if you would apply the same method, what the Emirates did around Abu Dhabi, where they used plenty of water, an island just in front of the city in the ocean has been transformed with the help of water from absolute desert in a complete blooming garden, a total joy to be there. This could be applied to the entire Middle East, or the so-called Near East and Middle East. You could transform this with the help of peaceful nuclear energy, green the deserts. You could build infrastructure. You could, bring in modern, fast train systems, extend the new Silk Road from China into, on the one side Turkey, but also into Egypt, into Africa, into Europe, via India, into all of Southwest Asia. You could integrate the Eurasian continent in a way which would make it a livable place for everybody and every nation of the Eurasian continent, collaborating in a win-win way with the United States. Now, many people may think this is a utopian conception, this will never happen, but I'm telling you, it is the interest of every nation on this planet to go in this direction, including of the United States. Because the issue is, what kind of a future are we building together? Are we capable of, making this world a human place? And can we put our forces together as spacefaring nations to colonize first nearby space, which is now on the agenda with the Mars missions, and beyond go into interstellar travel and find out what is this universe all about, which is so incredibly vast and has so many secrets for us still to discover. Now, I don't know if there is anybody responding to this, but I would like that this become, in this very incredible and dangerous moment, that this should become the international discussion against all odds.
Thank you very much for that, Helga. What we're going to do right now is introduce two other people who are with us today, and that is Mike Robinson of the United Kingdom and Harley Schlanger of Executive Intelligence Review, who's presently in Germany. And we were going to have some others that are going to be giving some presentations, but we wanted to say hello to them and bring them up on the screen so you know that they are here. Now, before we go to Mike, we are going to hear a presentation by Mr. Sultan Ali, who's a journalist and an author from Pakistan. Mr. Ali has spent decades studying the nation of China, traveled there extensively, and his presentation is going to discuss how China has used his Belt and Road Initiative to diffuse internal conflicts in the nation, but it also exposes some of their earlier history that surrounds the discussion concerning the Uyghur situation. And I think it might be the kind of thing that people can use to educate those that are still, unfortunately, listening to Mike Pompeo and his ilk. So we'll go right now to that presentation and then follow up with Mike Robinson.
Good afternoon. My name is Group Captain Sultan Mahmood Ali. I served in the Pakistan Air Force from 1970 till the year 2001, and I operated on the C-130 Hercules air transport aircraft. After my retirement, I took up journalism as a career, and I studied broadcast journalism in the USA. Now, before I come to the question of Uyghurs and also the number of allegations that have been leveled, I would like to point out that the Uyghur uprising, which came about much later, I'll just touch upon it. The United States, especially its intelligence agency, CIA, bears some responsibility. You may recall that in 1979, the USSR invaded Afghanistan, and there was a likelihood that this invasion would have continued across Pakistan, and Peter the Great's dream of reaching the warm waters of the Indian Ocean would have been materialized. CIA jumped into the fray, to stop USSR in its tracks, and Pakistan became its frontline ally. But of course, the CIA invited Muslims from all over the world to come and get training in guerrilla warfare, join the Afghan Mujahideen, and stop the Soviet invasion from incurring any further. Now, the jihadists or the volunteers who came from all over the world, they also included Uyghur Muslims from China. And all these people, they were imparted with frontline guerrilla warfare tactics. They were armed with the latest weapons. They were provided funds. And I'll not be repeating history, but just to sum it up, that in 1989, the Soviets were forced to retreat. Now here the Americans, they made a mistake. The mistake was that they should have de-radicalized these jihadists, these Muslims, and also taken back the weapons that they had supplied them. Instead, the CIA thought it was a job complete, and they departed in a hurry, and the world had to pay the price, including the United States, because 9/11 is a direct result of that, because organizations, extremist organizations like the Al-Qaeda, they came into being, and they were, trained in hard warfare, guerrilla warfare, and they were looking for enemies. Now, I'm not going to talk about the rest of the world, but as far as the Uyghurs were concerned, they returned to their homeland in Xinjiang. And at that time, now, while in 1986, Deng Xiaoping introduced his theory of economic openness, and China started developing economically very rapidly. But it was the eastern region that received the largest of the benefits, while the western region, mostly, Xinjiang is in that part, was extremely backward, and there was disparity. Now, when these Uyghurs, they came back, they saw the disparity, and they also saw an opportunity, and organizations like the Eastern Turkish Islamic movement, ETIM, they came into being, and they thought that they should demand separation from mainland China. Now, most of these people, they were extremists, and also, as the world of the extremists goes, they tend to distort religion. They also tend to use verses of the Quran to their own advantage, and they tried to instigate the other Uyghurs to rise, and they committed acts of terrorism. And you may recall that in 2009, there was the mass uprising. After that, the central government in China, it took very drastic measures. It was a two-pronged action. First was that they cracked down on the extremists. They arrested them, they tried them, and those who were found guilty of indulging in separatism, extremism, and terrorism, they were punished accordingly. But on the same plane, the Chinese government, they decided that the causes of deprivation and the disparity between the eastern region and the western region must be brought to a balance, so that there is no cause for the Uyghurs to be upset, as well as to find causes for terrorism or uprising and things like that. So at that time, I flew in to China as an aircrew on at least 70 different occasions, mostly to Xinjiang, and I have toured Xinjiang up and down. When I retired in 2020 and became a journalist and later a writer and an academic, I authored, so far I've authored 5 books. My 6th one is on its way, which is coming up on the 100th anniversary of the Chinese Communist Party. And I've been visiting China, and mainly Xinjiang, for research, for interviewing people. And I am an eyewitness to exactly what has been happening in Xinjiang. And I have seen the marked difference that was made over there. After the 2009 uprising, the Chinese government, they removed the squalid, camps and hutments and poor dwellings of the Uyghurs, and instead they erected high-rise apartments and asked the Uyghurs to move in over there. Of course, there was a catch here. What the Chinese did was that they also made a number of Han, the majority population of China, to move into Xinjiang and be neighbors of the Uyghurs so that there could be better amalgamation, better understanding. Simultaneously, the development projects were introduced so that the Uyghurs, they would, not feel deprived, and they would give up the acts of terrorism and extremism and separatism. Unfortunately, some detractors of China, they thought that Xinjiang is the soft underbelly of China, and perhaps they were envious of the rapid economic rise of China, and they may have instigated some of these Uyghurs, but I'll not go into that. But the fact is that the Chinese government, it analyzed what were the causes, and the main cause was, of course, as I mentioned earlier, the sense of deprivation, which was addressed by installing development projects. But the other was the distortion of religion. And to cater for that, there were institutions set up, and I have myself visited the Xinjiang Islamic Institute, which was established some 30 years ago. And I've met Abdul Rajab Tumniaz, who is the president of the institute. And I have seen with my own eyes that this institute is parallel to some of the finest universities of the United States of America, like Stanford or Berkeley and so on. It has fantastic facilities, but more importantly, it teaches imams, the religious leaders of especially Uyghurs and other Muslims in China, the balanced theories of Islam, because Islam, by the way, is not an extremist religion. It doesn't teach extremism. But the extremists, they take away, they distort the verses of the Quran. When President Xi Jinping came into power, that was in 2013, he installed the Belt and Road Initiative, which is exactly on the same route of the ancient Silk Road. And the major beneficiary of the Belt and Road Initiative is the province of Xinjiang, the Uyghur Autonomous Region. Fantastic facilities have been built. I've visited Kashgar. In fact, I've toured every inch of Xinjiang, and I have noticed that the facilities that have been created, and the Uyghurs have been given the chance to get into higher position by providing them with vocational training and specialist training. And like in Kashgar, once upon a time when I visited it much earlier, it was like in the boondocks and neglected place. Although in the age of the Silk Route, it was one of the major trading posts. But now if you go there, you find 7-star hotels and fantastic factories and so on. And the Belt and Road Initiative, it meanders all the way, reaches Kashgar, and from there it fans into Central Asia and onwards into Europe. And on the other side, China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, or CPEC as it is called over here, which starts from the Pakistani port of Gwadar, goes on and meets the BRI at Kashgar and becomes a part of it. Now, the Belt and Road Initiative has really paid dividends. And my last visit to Xinjiang was in July 2019. And after that, I have obviously been deprived of any further visit owing to coronavirus, because I used to visit very regularly for the research of my books, as well as I was invited by various universities to carry out research and, or rather deliver lectures and seminars and all. But I have seen that the Uyghurs there are living in prosperity and a far cry from the propaganda. What some of the Western reports have said about concentration camps or labor camps, they are in fact indoctrination centers. Those people who have been judged as having been misled or have gone astray from the teachings of Islam or from the teachings of normalcy, they are asked to enlist there. They are taught about the Chinese constitution, the Chinese law, and they are also given the opportunity to learn a vocational training. There is nothing of the so-called concentration camps and the allegation of rapes being carried out, of people living in squalid conditions. In fact, I found them extremely happy. I would like to mention here that I've also met a number of Pakistanis who have settled in Xinjiang province, who have married Uyghur women, they have children, and I've spoken to them and I've found them to be very satisfied people. Now, coming back to the Belt and Road Initiative, the United States has serious observations to it, but you see the question arises that if 70 countries of the world have joined it, and especially the majority of Europe, what are the reservations of the United States? It says that there is lack of transparency, but this transparency can be taken care of if the United States sits on the board and has a close look at what's going on.
So this is just an excerpt from Mr. Hali's full presentation, excerpted because of time. Full presentation is also able to be made available. And we'll return to the question of China a little bit later in this discussion. And everybody knows or should know that Lyndon LaRouche has often singled out the city of London for particular attention in the course of the more than 46 years that Executive Intelligence Review, the magazine that he founded, has existed. And that's because of the role that we've exposed over those years of the City of London and the financial institutions, including its derivative, Wall Street, in financial warfare, terrorism, and many other activities. Mike Robinson continues that time-honored tradition in his own way, and he's here to talk to us today about the latest news from Perfidious Albion, and I think I'll just leave it to him to go right into what he's got to tell us today. Mike?
Well, what I'd like to talk about is a little bit about the mechanism that the UK uses to pursue regime change, and how they manage narratives and so on. So I'm going to start with a little bit of history here and go back to early 2018. And the British press had headlines such as this from the Daily Express. UK using graphic videos in war of words with Putin. The Foreign Office is using sophisticated graphic videos in a counter-strike against Russian propaganda. And what struck me at the time about this was one sentence. They are said to be the brainchild of Andy Price, the Foreign Office's head of counter-disinformation and media development. Now, we had been following this idea of media development. I'll explain this a little bit more a little later. For a while. But the idea of the Foreign Office actually having a department of counter-disinformation and media development, this was a new admission. Now, the Express didn't go into any particular details about what that meant, and they never have. So as a result, frankly, we didn't know who Andy Price was. We didn't know anything about him. But there had been advertisements for jobs. Work with us. The UK Foreign Commonwealth Office is looking for talented, committed and capable individuals to join us on a 6 to 18-month project basis to counter disinformation and assess hybrid threats. And of course, this was all happening around the time of the alleged poisoning of Sergei Skripal. There was very much a narrative being built that Russia was pumping large amounts of disinformation into the UK, and we were also getting suggestions that Russia was interfering in UK elections, and we'll come on to that in a second. But the question was, who was Andy Price? Well, he was to be found at Stratcom in October 2018, giving a presentation, and he was in workshop 3B, which is all about addressing disinformation options available to government, civil society and the private sector. And what was interesting about this was that Stratcom published on YouTube all the videos from that event for all the workshops except for this one. For some reason, this one they didn't want to publish. Andy Price was also found with the Ministry of Information of Ukraine, all about countering cyber threats. This was an event held in London. He popped up again, this is all in 2018, at the European Endowment for Democracy. Here is a picture of him. Nobody really knows what was discussed at this because none of this was made public. Again, at Euractiv was talking about disinformation, the playbook and how to fight it, the 2018 Brussels Disinfo Lab. So we wanted to know, what is this man doing? What was the Foreign Office doing? We put a Freedom of Information request in, and it said, I'd like to get some background on the role currently held by Andy Price, the head of counter-disinformation. Could you tell me the scope of the role, the size of the team Andy Price has working with him, and when the role was created? And quick as a flash, we got a response. I can confirm that the Foreign and Commonwealth Office holds some information relevant to your request. However, this information is exempt under Section 24 of the National Security of the Freedom of Information Act. Section 24 is a qualified exemption, which means that it's subject to a public interest test. We acknowledge the public interest in openness and transparency, but we consider that there's also a public interest in the Foreign Office protecting national security. And they went on to say that having considered the request, we're concerned that the release would undermine the effective operation of its duties and consequently adversely affect on the UK's security. Now, the thing to note here is that this get-out clause for freedom of information in the UK is only used when the intelligence services are, it can only be used when the intelligence services are involved in some way. So this gave us a little bit more information, but nonetheless, we did eventually track him down. He had spent some time in the United States as the Deputy Consul General in Houston in February 2009. Prior to that, he'd been the UK's Head of Public Affairs in Washington from 2007 until 2009, and has had a career in the diplomatic service in the Foreign Office the whole time. So I decided that I wasn't prepared to accept this answer from the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. I asked them to review their response to me. And they said that, well, they initially claimed that the person who was handling my review had been moved to a new job, so they couldn't possibly answer in the time. So they're looking for someone else to continue the review and provide a response. Well, I wasn't prepared to accept that, so I went to the Information Commissioner, who is the regulator for freedom of information requests and information transparency. Well, they didn't have much luck either, because they have received a response from the Foreign Office, is what they said to me. And basically the Foreign Office, although they're prepared to disclose some information, they certainly weren't going to disclose very much. But the representative from the Information Commissioner's Office at least did go and meet with the Foreign Office and try to encourage them to be forthcoming. So let's just briefly have a look at what they actually said. They said the government takes the issue of disinformation as well as wider online manipulation very seriously. Disinformation is the deliberate creation, the dissemination of false and/or manipulated information that's intended to deceive and mislead audiences. The Russian government persistently uses disinformation as a tool to destabilize perceived enemies. This was evident in the sustained Russian disinformation campaign following the attack on Salisbury, Russia's illegal annexation of Crimea, and remains so with Russia's destabilization of East Ukraine and beyond. We will continue to work with EU and international partners to constrain the Russian government's ability to use disinformation and propaganda. The Prime Minister announced at the Eastern Partnership Summit last year that the UK would be spending around £100 million over 5 years in the eastern neighbourhood to counter disinformation. It is as important as ever that Russian speakers, wherever they are, have a choice of media they consume and are able to access reliable and objective information. It's therefore vital that local, public and independent media serving Russian-speaking audiences can flourish. And they ended up by saying this financial year we're investing approximately £8 million in supporting public service and independent media. This includes projects in the Baltic states, Ukraine, as well as pan-regional initiatives. In addition, we're working with the governments in Baltic states alongside the British Council and others to address issues such as media literacy and societal integration. So this seemed to be all about countering Russian narratives abroad. That's how it seemed to be. But then Anonymous, the hacking group, decided that they were going to expose an organization called the Institute for Statecraft. So this was their website in 2018. All content has been temporarily removed from this site pending an investigation into the theft of data from the Institute of Statecraft and its program, the Integrity Initiative. So basically what had happened was that Anonymous had hacked this website and grabbed a lot of data, which they then made publicly available. It was extremely embarrassing for the Institute for Statecraft because what it showed was that the counter-disinformation and media development program wasn't just about countering what the Foreign Office were describing as countering disinformation in foreign countries. It was actually for a domestic European and US audience as well. So the Integrity Initiative was headed up by this man, Chris Donnelly, and they issued a statement, which I'm not going to read, on the Russian media publication of hacked documents. Of course, the allegation always that the Russians were pushing this. This was never the case. It wasn't a Russian hack. And certainly the people that were presenting the information to the public weren't Russian. Nonetheless, we saw plenty of headlines like this from the likes of Carol Cadwallader, who was on the list of journalists, UK-based journalists, who were working with the Integrity Initiative to provide opposition to so-called Russian disinformation narratives. So where does that take us? A tweet from Carol Cadwallader, and she's very much suggesting that Boris Johnson, the current Prime Minister, he was Foreign Secretary at the time, was at the NATO summit on Russia's reckless and destabilizing activity as Foreign Secretary in the midst of Skripal crisis. Incredibly, he then slipped his security detail and flew to Russian's house to meet ex-KGB agent. This man is now our PM. So this constant narrative of Russia involvement in British politics, Russia destabilizing British politics, Russian disinformation. We had more from her. This recklessness is off the charts, and so on. But if we go back to the Integrity Initiative for a second and have a look at this, the West is once again failing to test set by Russian aggression. This was the kind of narrative that we were getting. The right response would have combined kinetic, symbolic and financial measures. A NATO naval flotilla in the Black Sea would pay a friendly visit to Mariupol. Bilateral military assistance to Ukraine would be stepped up. Countries like Britain would announce forthcoming legislation to restrict the rights of anonymously owned shell companies, and so on. This is the kind of thing that we saw. At the same time, that was Edward Lucas, of course, I should mention, who writes for the Economist and other outlets, the Times as well, and he again was on the list of Integrity Initiative. At the same time that this was all going on, of course, in the United States, we had Russiagate, and we had these types of people involved in Russiagate. Christopher Steele, of course, the former MI6 agent who was the author of the Trump dossier, Stephen Halper, Alexander Downer, Joseph Mifsud, Richard Dearlove, former head of MI6, and so on. But these were the same people that were, to some degree, involved in the Skripal affair as well. Richard Dearlove and Christopher Steele in particular, through Pablo Miller. And Pablo Miller was the controller of Sergei Skripal while he was in the UK. So we saw the same names coming up, pursuing this notion of Russian disinformation and creating and building narratives about the Russian influence in UK politics, Russian attacks on UK shores. The same kinds of narratives that you were seeing with respect to Russian allegations of interference in the United States as well. But the Integrity Initiative, it turned out, had a bit of a problem because they were registered as a charity and they gave their address on the Scottish Charity Commission website as a particular venue, Gateside Mills in Fife in Scotland. And so my colleague David Scott thought he would, since he lived just a few miles away, would go and have a look. And unfortunately what he discovered was that Gateside Mills in fact was a derelict building. It was in the process of being demolished, and so it couldn't possibly have been hosting a charity countering disinformation, Russian disinformation. So what was this all about? Something not quite right there. So we wrote to the Scottish Charity Commission and I said, could I get a media statement, please, detailing penalties for charities registered with you which has apparently submitted false information. For example, the Institute for Statecraft registered charity number has listed Gateside Mills as its principal office, yet this address is semi-derelict, empty, and is undergoing partial demolition. Could you also provide me what processes and procedures you follow to confirm that data filed is valid? And as a result, the Scottish charity regulator, they said that this was an offence and that they were going to start an inquiry into the Integrity Initiative. And that was a step forward because they could not be really allowed to continue to do what they were doing. So anyway, eventually the Scottish Charity Regulator published its findings for its inquiry into the Institute for Statecraft. And that said, we wrote to the charity in August 2019, setting out our interim findings and seeking a response from the trustees. Concerning the charity's failure to meet its charity test, we indicated that we might find it necessary to direct the charity to take steps to address these issues, failing which we would remove it from the charity register. And so ultimately, the Institute for Statecraft ceased to undertake any activity related to the Integrity Initiative and is now undertaken by a non-charitable entity having no legal connection to the charity. So this was a positive development. Integrity Initiative effectively ceased to exist at that point. But in the meantime, the British government itself was busy establishing a whole network of infrastructure to handle this situation. So at the head of it at the time was this man, Mark Sedwill, and he actually was the first person in British history to ever be the head of the British Civil Service, the head of the British Cabinet Office, and the National Security Advisor, so effectively in control of the Foreign Office. Well, if you remember some history, which EIR has mentioned in the past, the former British counter-disinformation organisation within the Foreign Office was called the Information Research Department. That was replaced by the Counter-Disinformation and Media Development Programme with perhaps 30 years in between. That set up the Integrity Initiative, now known as the Open Information Partnership, and this is it. And so they work with NGOs, charities, academics, think tanks, journalists, fact-checkers and activists, and they join together in response to the rising tide of manipulated information, this constant Russian narrative. But let's look again further at the UK's infrastructure, because Mark Sedwill, in charge of the various intelligence services on the left there, but they started setting up counter-disinformation units inside the Cabinet Office. The Rapid Response Unit is there to counter any narratives appearing on social media, for example, which are contrary to UK government narratives. And they set up, or they reinvigorated 77th Brigade to actually monitor what's going on social media. But when you look at the people behind or involved in 77th Brigade, you find links back to Integrity Initiative. So although the organisation itself is gone, some of the people involved with it absolutely still active, of course. Headlines continuing. Here's the BBC. Russian spies target coronavirus vaccine. The National Cybersecurity Centre pushing out more information on this. APT 29 targets COVID-19 vaccine development. The NCSC assesses that AP29, also named the Dukes or Cozy Bear, almost certainly operate as part of Russian intelligence service, that they're running a campaign of malicious activity against government, diplomatic, think tank, healthcare and energy targets, that they warned that apt groups have been targeting organisations involved in both national and international COVID-19 responses, and that they were targeting UK, US and Canadian vaccine research and development organisations. So this narrative just continues, it never ends. We're 95% confident that the attacks we investigated came from Russia. Didn't end there, because here was the head of the National Cybersecurity Centre saying, we condemn these despicable attacks. The Foreign Secretary saying, it's completely unacceptable that Russian intelligence services are targeting those working to combat the coronavirus pandemic. So that narrative was continuing to be presented, but there was more work going on by the British government against Russia, and that was coming from the Intelligence and Security Committee of Parliament. And they had initially intended to present their report, Russia, back in October 2019. In fact, they didn't do that. It was finally released in July 2020. Well, here is some of the commentary from the Intelligence Committee on this. They said they found it astonishing that no one in government had sought beforehand to protect the referendum. Well, which referendum are they talking about? Well, of course, that's the Brexit referendum, because apparently Russia interfered in that. And as a result, we saw things like this from British media. Key paragraphs of the Russia report, paragraphs 39 to 45, UK government of Theresa May and Boris Johnson did not seek evidence of Russian interference in British politics, including during the 2016 EU referendum. MI6 sent cursory note when asked about it. So the Russia report then said, there has been credible open source commentary suggesting Russia undertook influence campaigns in relation to the Scottish independence referendum in 2014. So it wasn't just the US general election, it was also the UK Brexit referendum, the Scottish independence referendum. Russia is involved in every, or interfering with every election on the planet, it seems. The written evidence provided to us appeared to suggest that HMG had not seen or sought evidence of successful interference in UK democratic processes or any activity that has a material impact on an election, for example, influencing results. And it also said, we understand that HMG viewed this as being primarily aimed at discrediting the UK's in the eyes of a domestic Russian audience. And they mention a study from Ben Nimmo. But not just Ben Nimmo, because he gave evidence for this report. Who else was giving evidence for this report? Well, Carol Cadwallader, Edward Lucas, Integrity Initiative. Who have we got now? Bill Browder, of course, Chris Donnelly, and Christopher Steele. They all gave evidence to that, to the Russia report. So this was Integrity Initiative still at work behind the scenes. We had reports from the Press Gazette is sort of an industry journal for the media in the UK. Russia reports social media firms failing to play part in tackling covert hostile state activity. And this was all about social media activity, the Russians, and making sure that online harms becomes an issue, and legislation is needed to protect the British public from Russian disinformation. So where does that take us? In parallel with what we've seen with respect to dealing with Russian narratives, we then had a much broader network being developed for propaganda. I'm just going to wait for this to continue through here a little bit. And they built more institutions under the Cabinet Office. So we had the Rapid Response Unit. They then set up a National Security Communications Team with 77 Brigade, which we'd already mentioned. And then they added 13th Signals, another British Army section to this. So the propaganda network starting to be built out within the UK at least. So questions from the press, from the mainstream press, again from people linked to the same groups after the Russia report criticism, should there be a new investigation into the Brexit vote. This was largely possibly unreported outside the UK, but the narrative that Russia was interfering in our elections was very, very clear. So myself and some colleagues decided to run some events putting the media on trial. And some of those individuals included academics from some of the universities in the UK. A guy called Professor Piers Robinson was speaking. Peter Ford, the former ambassador to Syria, was speaking at that. And various reports subsequently came out from what was set up, the working group on Syria, propaganda and media. This was a group of academics that were pushing very, very hard to try to counter this narrative in the UK that Russia was destabilizing the planet. And they, in fact, ended up on the front page of the Times because although they were countering the Integrity Initiative and so on, they were also countering the narrative on Syria. And so they became labeled as apologists for Assad working in universities. And they came under sustained pressure and are still under sustained pressure for pursuing these investigations. Now, coming up to date then, let's just put this on screen for a second. This is an email that I received, again from Anonymous, because they were continuing to leak documents, but this time it wasn't from a public website, from an organization that put files on a public website that they really shouldn't have had. This was from within the Foreign Office itself. So the files were released on the 13th of February. The allegation from Anonymous here was that these files demonstrated that the UK was working towards regime change in Russia and that they were showing how that was happening. Now, the files that were released were then covered just a few days ago by Max Blumenthal in Consortium News. And Max Blumenthal quoted Chris Williamson, who's a former Labour MP, saying this, that the revelations show that when MPs were railing about Russia, British agents were using the BBC and Reuters to deploy precisely the same tactics that politicians and media commentators were accusing Russia of using. And this, of course, is one of the themes of all the work that we've done over the last number of years. We see the British government time and again accusing Russia and China of the types of tactics that they use. Now, I'm just going to very briefly put this on screen, but I'm not going to read it all because Chris Williamson did put some parliamentary questions in about the counter-disinformation and media development programme to the British government in Parliament while he was still an MP, and he basically couldn't get any more information from Alan Duncan, who was the Foreign Office Minister responsible at the time, than I was able to do through Freedom of Information. So it was pretty clear that the British government did not want to give any serious information out about what they were up to with this organisation. But if we go back to the Consortium News article for a second, and the quote here is, the leaks illustrate in alarming detail how Reuters and the BBC, two of the largest and most distinguished news organisations in the world, attempted to answer the British Foreign Ministry's call for help in improving its ability to respond and to promote our message across Russia and to counter the Russian government's narrative. Among the FCO's stated goals, according to the director of CDMD, was to weaken the Russian state's influence on its near neighbours. Well, Reuters and the BBC are mentioned there, but in fact, it's not Reuters, the organisation itself, and the BBC, the organisation itself, as corporations. It's two sub-organisations which have charitable status. In the case of Reuters, it's the Thomson Reuters Foundation, and in the case of the BBC, it's BBC Media Action. And just to give an impression of how this works, here's a quote from a former employee of BBC Media Action, Juliet Harkin, and she said this in 2012 for the BBC Media Action's Syria report. And she said, we, BBC Media Action, worked in 2004 with individuals within the Syrian ministry who wanted change and tried to get them to be drivers of that. all media development work that has been done in Syria has, in my opinion, been predicated upon this idea that there can be change from within. You have an authoritarian regime and you find who the reformers are within that and you work with them. And so that seemed pretty clear. This is what they did in Syria. They've done the same in other countries, and they have clearly attempted to do the same in Russia and countries that they view have Russian influence. But we should bring another case on here, because here is Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe. Now, she's actually not still in prison in Iran. She's in house arrest at the moment. So whether she goes back into prison, we have to wait and see. She was accused by Iran of attempting to destabilize the state. Thomson Reuters Foundation said absolutely not. They said these charges are linked to her work at BBC Media Action and at the Thomson Reuters Foundation. But this is a complete invention, as the Thomson Reuters Foundation doesn't work in Iran and has no program or dealings with Iran. But unfortunately, Boris Johnson, who was the Foreign Secretary at the time, said, well, when we look at what Nazanin Zaghari-Ratcliffe was doing, she was simply teaching people journalism, as I understand it, at the very limit. Now, the way this works is that BBC Media Action and Thomson Reuters Foundation go into countries and they attempt to change cultures. So, for example, excuse me, in Kazakhstan, BBC Media Action went in and they brought in the idea of soap operas and let's pursue certain cultural change through popular culture in soap opera form. In Syria, as we've already mentioned, they went in and they attempted to find the reformers and they attempted to encourage them to bring about change from within. So they were encouraging change agents. But one of the other things that they did in Syria, and they do in other countries as well, is that they went in, they trained journalists, and those journalists became the representatives of the UK, the British narrative in those countries. So, for example, when Channel 4 News in the UK was generating, trying to generate a desire in the UK or a willingness in the UK public to see Syria bombed, they used journalists in Syria that had been trained by the likes of BBC Media Action, because they were effectively feeding those people the UK Foreign Office narrative that they wanted to see being fed back into British and European and United States media. So as time went on, then we saw the likes of Oliver Dowden, who is the digital secretary, defending this country from misinformation and digital interference is a top priority. So I've shown you the infrastructure that the UK government has built to do that. It's actually extended that somewhat in the past year. We now not only have a rapid response unit, which is all about monitoring social media and countering the narratives on social media. We have a National Security Communications team, a 77th Brigade doing largely the same thing, 13 Signals the same. We now have the Department of Digital, Culture, Media and Sport Fake News Unit, which is doing much the same. We have a Freedom of Information Clearinghouse, which has been established to monitor some key journalists, activists and others who are putting in freedom of information requests. It doesn't matter which government department or which government agency receives that freedom of information request. If it's come from somebody on the list, they will send that to the Cabinet Office and the Cabinet Office will respond to those. And finally, we have what is now being described as Hut 18, and this is another UK Army group that is running an information war against Russia and China in particular. And I'll just end with this, because this is Theresa May, who at the G7 leaders meeting in 2018 established or got agreement to establish a rapid response mechanism. And this, the idea of this rapid response mechanism was that there would be a common narrative between all the G7 countries particularly with respect to Russia and China, that there would be agreement and the pursuit of a common narrative, and that common narrative would be pushed out by governments and pushed through the media to the public in all the G7 countries. This is sort of the mechanism that they've built to force regime changes in countries, or attempt to force regime changes in countries that they want to see, or that seem to be coming out, or they perceive are coming under Russian influence. And it seems with the latest leaks, Russia itself.
Well, thank you very much, Mike. We will be getting to questions. There are people that are asking about that, so it's questions at schillerinstitute.org. We've run that a couple of times, and we'll get to that. We're going to go next back to China, and this is a presentation by Dr. Tianjiao Zhang. He's assistant professor at Fudan Development Institute. He also works as an assistant director at the Center for BRIC Studies and Cyberspace International Governance Research Institute at Fudan University. So we'll do this presentation, and then that will be following that by Harley Schlanger.
Hello, everyone. I'm Tianjiao from Fudan University. Thank you for Ms. Zhang's invitation. I'm so sorry, because of the time difference, I can only share my views through video. First of all, I want to quote Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi said on the Nanting Forum several days ago. Humanity must not lose confidence facing the unprecedented common challenges of the global pandemic, economic recession, and climate change. As two major countries, China and the United States, should first take care of their own stuff, and at the same time, they should also work together for the common good of humankind. This is the expectation of the international community and due responsibility of major countries. However, the previous U.S. administration, out of its own political needs, seriously distorted China's future path and policy, and on that basis, took various measures to suppress and contain China. The first distorted story I want to talk about is the China-US economic and trade relations. The Trump administration and many Americans accused China of unfair competition, which caused a large trade deficit in the United States and even robbed Americans of their jobs. Anyone with a little common sense of economics knows that this is a lie of some American politicians. The root cause of the US trade deficit is that Americans do not save and consume ahead of time. This is indeed a trade imbalance between China and the United States. But the biggest imbalance is that the United States prohibits the export of high-end technology products to China. At the same time, due to China's relatively low-cost and mature labor market and the broad domestic consumer market, a large number of American multinational enterprises invest in China, transferring American jobs to China and making a lot of profits from China. Or instead of distributing their profits to the unemployed and the middle and the low-income groups in the United States, these multinational companies have been working with politicians to lie that China has robbed them of their jobs. The unfair social system serving the 1% people, the capitalists in the United States, is the root cause of the current economic challenges in the United States. The United States launched a trade war against China and increased the tariffs, which not only did not fundamentally solve the problem, but also increased the living costs of the American people. The second story is about 5G and Huawei. In the past few years, the trade war between China and the United States has gradually risen to the level of science and technology war. And even the red technology threat has emerged in the United States. Technology itself is objective and neutral. Whether it is 5G, big data, cloud computing, or artificial intelligence, China and the United States use the same technology. However, the United States always criticizes China's technology for a large number of security backdoors, which are used for censorship, surveillance, and human rights violations. In fact, the United States is doing the same thing with the same technology. The NSA used PRISM project to monitor the whole world Facebook provides Cambridge Analytica with users' privacy data and manipulates US elections. Many social media companies use big data and artificial intelligence to supervise public opinion and delete posts. I think many of the practices mentioned here are essentially the use of scientific and technological means to sacrifice the freedom of some people to protect the freedom of most people and national security. So China and the United States are doing the same thing with the same technology. Why does the United States think that China's technology must be evil? I think this is a binary opposition view of China in the history of the Western countries. The United States is very worried that if it is overtaken by an Eastern civilization in science and technology, it will not only lose the international market, but also lose its leadership and prestige in the world. Therefore, for Chinese enterprises like Huawei, the United States will suppress them at all costs. In history, the United States has taken the same measures against Toshiba of Japan and Alstom of France. The Biden administration should rationally view China's rise in the field of high technology, and China is very likely to surpass in some areas. China and the United States should strengthen cooperation in key technology areas including green energy, nuclear fusion, space exploration, biomedicine, and digital technology for the common benefits of humankind. Well, the third story is about the military field. I focus on arms control research, so I share some views on China-US nuclear relations. A few days ago, I refuted the speech of the commander of the US Strategic Command in the People's Daily. General Richard believes that China is likely to be the first to launch a nuclear strike against the United States. This is groundless, even ridiculous, I think. China has been adhering to no first-use policy since 1964. On the contrary, the United States has been nuclear blackmailing China for a long time since the Cold War. After the end of Cold War, even though China and the United States signed an agreement on non-targeting nuclear weapons against each other, the US administration still insisted on listing China as a nuclear strike target. At the same time, the United States keeps more than 3,000 nuclear weapons and constantly strengthens its missile defense and conventional weapons capabilities. China is not on the same level as the United States in terms of nuclear weapons. However, many experts in the United States often question China's no first use policy and put forward the assumption that if the United States attacked China's nuclear arsenals with conventional weapons, China would break its NFU policy. Well, in China's view, such assumption is provocative. China's no first use policy is not only a political commitment, but also conducive to promoting nuclear arms control and easing tensions. But the questions and assumptions raised by the United States make China think that the United States is always ready to launch conventional attacks on China's nuclear arsenals. As a president from a Democratic Party, Biden should be inclined to promote arms control. If the United States really wants to carry out arms control negotiations with China, rather than expanding its military strengths on this pretext, it should start with no first use policy. However, I'm not optimistic about the future of Biden administration's promotion of no first use policy. The military-industrial complex, including General Richard, will certainly block this progressive policy. The United States has invested heavily in maintaining its nuclear arsenals and developing new types of nuclear weapons. But ironically, the United States, as the world's leading power, has paid an extremely painful price before COVID-19. Recently, Texas also suffered from snowstorms and long-term power failure, resulting in extremely serious accidents. The Biden administration should spend more energy and money to improve the domestic medical system and infrastructure construction, than building more expensive weapon systems to coerce other countries. Well, I want to say that when I studied in the United States in 2014 and 2016, many airports and stations in the United States made me feel like I was in a developing country or even underdeveloped one. Many Americans lacked awareness of energy conservation and environmental protection. No one in the room has air conditioning on all the time, and the temperature is extremely low. I have learned a lot when I studied in the US, but also noticed these shortcomings. However, it is a pity that in recent years, instead of improving domestic development, the US government has blindly accused China, prohibited China from investing in key infrastructures, and even cut off trade with China. I really hope that Biden administrations can face up these problems. As Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi said, COVID-19, climate change, and world economic recovery are the three most pressing tasks for the international community. I hope both sides can work together on these issues first and rebuild mutual trust step by step. That's all for my thinking. Thank you.
As you can see, the presenters today are contending that the world is considerably different than the view of the world that will be presented at the CPAC convention on CNN, Fox News, the New York Times, or any place else in the United States. Getting the United States and its citizens an independent evaluative platform from which to look at the world is the job of the Executive Intelligence Review magazine and, of course, the Schiller Institute in particular, which is an international organization dedicated to the idea of the dialogue of cultures. This does not require agreement. This requires consideration, reflection, and then contention based on having heard what someone else thinks, which may be considerably different than what you think. It takes more than desire, however, to get that kind of independent evaluation. It takes courage, and it takes the ability to actually analyze and look at the world for what it is. We're going to go now to Harley Schlanger, who is a well-known blogger, journalist, and he's well-known to everybody who's been following Lyndon LaRouche for decades. And let's see what Harley has to say in response to both what he's heard and what he has seen going on, particularly in the United States over the past period, let's say post-January 20th. Harley?
Well, thank you, Dennis, and hello, everyone. My topic today is going to be who or what is the real enemy of the United States? Because as we're seeing from the other presentations, we do face a very serious world crisis. You have the US strikes in Syria. You have talk escalating about a possible intervention against Iran. There are new sanctions possible almost on any day against Russia and China. Now, we just had the Trump presidency, which represented a potential for a break with the Bush-Obama policy of confrontation with Russia and China and the launching of wars. The president, Trump, came into office pledging that he would cooperate with Russia and China. He had meetings with Putin, meetings with President Xi. We had the collaboration in Syria of the US military and the Russian military on some level, which was responsible for the defeat of the ISIS caliphate. We also saw the collaboration with Putin and Xi and President Trump in the progress being made toward disarmament in North Korea, which unfortunately was sabotaged by people of the president's own staff, in particular John Bolton, and the continuing efforts by Mike Pompeo, a charter member of the Warhawk faction inside the Republican Party and unfortunately inside the Trump administration. From the time President Trump got in, we heard a chorus of Russia, Russia, Russia. This became the whole question of Russiagate, the attempt to accuse Putin and Trump of colluding to win the election against Hillary Clinton through hacking, through meddling, through use of troll farms and so on, all of which, when the end came in the Mueller Commission investigation, proved to be false. And the suppressed material that would show that this was a campaign by a cabal of criminals from US intelligence, from the political parties, from the media, from the think tanks, aided and collaborated completely with British intelligence, was unfortunately suppressed. We never got the documentation fully released, although many of the names, especially the names Mike Robinson went through, are familiar to people because of the commitment of President Trump, and I should say also the commitment of our organization to get the truth out as to who was running Russiagate and why. But the anti-Russia narrative is continuing. You can see it in the claims of the solar wind hack. We even saw Pelosi and Hillary Clinton do a podcast where they said they wondered if President Trump was talking to Vladimir Putin while the Capitol was under attack on January 6th. But increasingly, the Russia, Russia, Russia chorus is being replaced by another one: China, China, China. And it's coming from the same circles. The Atlantic Council is very much involved in this. They're putting forward an idea called the D10 to replace the G7. What's the D10? It's the G7, adding Australia, India, and South Korea as part of a containment, encirclement of China and Russia. We also saw the publication of the longer telegram in the Atlantic Council, which was a repeat in a somewhat more modern guise of the 1946 document, which which actually escalated the Cold War with the idea of containment of Russia. So we have to ask the question as we see this. And I should add one other thing. Senator Tom Cotton just essentially declared war against China at the Reagan Institute on February 18th in a speech he gave titled "Beat China: Targeted Decoupling and the Economic Long War." Cotton is a neocon Republican, and his view is representative of people like Marco Rubio and Ted Cruz in the Republicans, Robert Menendez, and a number of people on the Democratic side. So we have to ask the question, are Russia and China really the enemies of the United States? And to look at this, I want to bring up the two biggest crises we face. First of all, the war danger. And I'll start by saying President Trump was right in saying that the endless wars were carried out by the US military-industrial complex, and that this included the Bush and Obama teams, the CIA, contractors, and also support from the British and NATO. But they were not caused by Russia and China. These were wars which cost American lives, which cost trillions of dollars, which destroyed nations, killed many people, and led to a refugee crisis which continues. And the question you have to ask yourself is, did Russia and China have anything to do with the United States getting into these wars? No. It was American war hawks. It was neocons in both parties in collaboration with the British Foreign Office, with British intelligence, and NATO. So the question there of who's behind this, it has nothing to do with Russia and China. Now, secondly, the other major crisis we face is the breakdown of the financial system and the collapse of the physical economy in the United States. Were those caused by Russia and China? Well, there's some people who say, well, China has conducted enemy operations against the US economy, but let's look at this more closely. The free market, free trade policies, the neoliberal policies, which President Trump identified as the cause of the trade imbalance, because it meant multinational corporations could go to China and produce goods more cheaply with cheap labor, no regulation, no quality control. But what happened? As the Chinese developed, they insisted on paying their workers better wages, on improving environmental concerns. And as a result, as the prices went up, the corporations were demanding that something be done to stop that. What President Trump said is that China took advantage of the global trade agreements, but they didn't write them. These global trade agreements were written by the multinational corporations. by the same military-industrial complex that ran the wars. So, and where did the model come from? Thatcher and Tony Blair. And this is now being enshrined in the Davos World Economic Forum Great Reset, a global regime of supranational institutions under the control of the private banks and private corporations, the corporate cartels running a global financial system over and above the interests of nation states. So when President Trump was asserting the importance of national sovereignty, he also said that he was concerned with national sovereignty for other nations as well. And this is something that was repeated recently by Joe Biden, and we'll see how serious he is about that. Now, one other aspect of this globalist policy, this neoliberal policy, is privatization and deregulation, which opened the door for speculation to dominate economic policy. This is what Lyndon LaRouche called the global casino. The idea that the biggest multinational corporations, banks, shadow banking system can determine the trade agreements and the value of money, the volume of currency, and that this is not being done for the interests of the people of sovereign nation states, but for the profit level, the shareholder value, now they're calling it stakeholder value, of the leading speculative swindlers in the world. Now, one other aspect of this is the green policy. And by the way, let me simply say something that people have missed, many people have missed, because they're focused on the deep freeze in Texas, they're focused on windmills. That's useful because windmills play a role. The whole shift to green technology played a big role in the breakdown of the electricity grid. But equally important in that was the deregulation policy, where in the name of competition, corporations were allowed to go in and sell energy at below cost and save money by not doing maintenance, upgrading, winterizing, things of that sort. And we see how people, 4 to 5 million people in Texas, paid for that, with some people freezing to death, but many, many other people fearing for their lives as a result of the experiment with green energy and deregulation. Now, the green policy was exposed by us at the EIR in our new report, The Great Leap Backward. But where did the Green New Deal come from? Prince Charles, Mark Carney of the Bank of England, the shadow banking trusts of the City of London, in combination with the major corporations that are all now agreeing to this, and most of the private banks that Carney and Fink of BlackRock have gotten to sign a compact that there'll be no more lending to physical economic production, only to Green New Deal and a green bubble. So when you look at this situation, what do you see as the major problem facing the United States right now? First, we have economic deconstruction. And this is going to be put on a flight forward with the Great Reset if it's not stopped. Secondly, the destruction of efficient, reliable energy production, the so-called Green New Deal, which has a long history of coming from leading British financial circles, as well as their collaborators in the United States. And wars, neoconservatives, the military-industrial complex. And as Mike Robinson showed, that there is, from the British Foreign Office, a very detailed structure to blame Russia for any problem that comes up in the world. Now, when you look at this, you see that we are facing foreign enemies and domestic enemies. The foreign enemies include this whole British network, the Five Eyes, which also includes Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the United States, the intelligence community that ran Russiagate against President Trump because of their opposition to his attempt to break with the geopolitical doctrines of the Bush and the Obama era and to move us into cooperation with Russia and China. On the domestic side, this was the Bush Republicans. This was virtually the whole Democratic Party. That for them, no lie was too blatant that they wouldn't repeat it over and over and over, and up to the present day on Russia and China. Now, Trump was targeted because of this, but who else was targeted? President Putin and President Xi Jinping, the presidents of Russia and China. Why? Because these are leaders of nations that intend to assert the sovereign rights of their governments to defend and advance the interests of their people, just as President Trump was trying to do in the United States and any decent American president would do for the American people. So the target here was sovereign nation states with an ability to use science and technology, to use an investment policy to build the physical economy, to work together and collaborate, not just to improve the economic conditions of their people, but of people around the world, as we see with the China land bridge policy, the Belt and Road Initiative going into Africa and South Asia. Therefore, I would argue that those who are focused on Russia and China as the main enemies of the United States and the West have fallen for the biggest sucker operation being run on the planet, run by British geopolitics. This goes back to the early 1900s and the manipulation of a divide and conquer strategy, which led to 2 world wars in that century, the Cold War leading up to the end of the century, and then in the post-Cold War period, the unilateralism of an Anglo-American empire in which American military might is being used to defend the interests, the combined interests of the City of London, Wall Street, and Silicon Valley. American military might deployed to defend a speculative, bankrupt system. And war is used to protect that bankrupt financial system and to deflect the population from actually raising the right questions. Do we really have conflict of interest with Russia and China? With the false flags, the fake enemies, the fake news, people are confused. But this is where you have to cut to the real core of the matter. Lyndon LaRouche was not confused. Lyndon LaRouche put forward an idea consistently over nearly 3 decades of the need for the United States, Russia, and China as the 3 most powerful nations, and then bringing in India, to form an agreement to work as sovereign nations against the globalist regime of the international banks centered around the International Monetary Fund, the City of London, and Wall Street. You needed these 4 powers because you needed sovereign nations that had a certain amount of military muscle, but more importantly, an economic capability and a potential and a willingness to invest in the future. That's what the 4-power agreement is about. And that's why the solution to the problems we face in the United States now, collapsing infrastructure, the drug problem, the pandemic problem, the lack of health care, you name it, homelessness that is threatening to become so much bigger. You look at all these problems, and the solution starts with a collaboration with other great nations to address the common interests of mankind. And these 4 sovereign nations have a shared interest in defeating the Great Reset and the global Green New Deal. And the key is for the citizens to understand the true nature of the battle of a declining empire, which has been declining for several centuries now, but used its wile and guile and chicanery to subvert an American establishment and win it over to be a co-partner in a global policy that should have ended at the end of World War II. So this is what is in front of American citizens now. And that's why the LaRouche organization is having these kinds of discussions to bring people into an in-depth development picture of the world from the top, not from the local prejudices or anger or a sense of victimization. But what does the future demand of the United States? What does the future demand of any country? so that it can act for the interests of its people, not just now, but for the next 2 or 3 generations. So I'd encourage you to join us in this ongoing series to get the Great Reset, the Great Leap Backward report that we have that will tell you who's involved in this and why, and to join us in this discussion, not just with us, but with your friends and neighbors and family, because we have to win this fight if we're going to secure the future. So thank you very much.
Yeah, and thank you, Harley. While we have a couple of other things, I want to go back to Helga and just ask, given how the amount that has been stated in various things, and see, Helga, if you have something you'd like to say at this point in response to anything you've heard or in addition to anything you've heard.
I think that what Mike Robinson was saying is really worth to go out all over the world, because that is exactly what is happening. You know, they're projecting their own evil deeds on the other people and blame that they are doing what they are doing. And this question of regime change, as you describe it, you know, that's exactly what's in this Atlantic Council, the longer telegram, you know, trying to get opposition figures in the Chinese communist leadership to topple Xi Jinping. So I think this, you know, is a really absolutely explosive package. And I also thought that what the scholar from Pakistan, Sultan Hali, said is also absolutely confirms everything I have heard and read about Xinjiang, and it's I think a very good antidote. So I think we should really get this out widely.
Okay, fine. We have just the final presentation, which we're going to hear, which came from Daisuke Katagawa, who was formerly the head of the IMF for Japan. He prepared a short video for today, and we'll play that, and then we'll come right back for discussion among all the panelists and questions also, some of which have begun to come in.
Yeah, the first thing I'd like to say is what's behind the anti-Russian campaign which is going right now. My view is that after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, Western countries failed to incorporate Russia into the Western camp, basically losing the support of the Russian people due to the introduction of misguided policies centered around, I think, by Jeffrey Sachs to collapse Russian economic society and exploited the Russian, I think, general public. At that time, the lives of the Russian people were really miserable, with the pensions of about only $50 per month, and countless young women lined up I think in a very severe blizzard in winter on both sides of Albatskaya Street, which is equivalent to the Fifth Avenue in New York, to wait for customers. Western leaders seem to have regrets about this failure they made and are afraid of a kind of revenge by Russian people. It should be noted that it was the policies of Western countries after the collapse of the Soviet Union that brought about Putin's government with popular support, and that the Russian people supported Putin, who brought stability by solving the problems of the 1990s after the collapse of the Soviet Union. In addition, so-called neocons, these groups increase their raison de value by fueling the conduct, I think fueling the conflict between the East and the West. This is the same for the military-industrial complex. It is very interesting to see that people belong to this camp often have ancestors coming from Russia, Ukraine, or Baltic countries. I think American leaders should restore their self-confidence in their own economy and also society and also democracy. And Trump actually, in my view, launched among towards that kind of objective as first step. So to restore the confidence in your system is the first thing you are supposed to do. And further, secondly, I believe that it is very, very important to understand your counterparts. This means I hope that more and more American people should understand what Russia would like to do and China would like to, as well as the long history between the United States and China, and also between the United States and Russia. And first of all, I'd like to emphasize that Putin, if you study their society, Putin is not a dictator. He's a man who basically balances the opinions of various interest groups inside Russia. And his sentiments are rather close to the West. It is true that he's from the KGB, but it should be kept in your mind that it was the KGB people who knew foreign countries the best at the time of the Soviet era. And number two, it was Russia under Empress Ekaterina that helped the United States become independent from Britain. And so Russia helped the United States as well as France. And it was again Russia that sent a fleet to prevent British intervention while the British tried to support the Confederate at the Civil War. Because of such friendly relations, Russia sold Alaska to the United States, which where its maintenance costs became too high. In the same way, China was the U.S. biggest trading partner after independence, since the Atlantic Ocean was held by the British. U.S. trade headed for the Pacific Ocean, and while the U.S. had the silver that the Qing dynasty in China demanded to pay for trade, Britain, which imported large quantities of tea from China, did not have silver and became nearly a failed nation. Then Britain smuggled opium from India to China, and the smuggling of opium was forcefully made legal by way of the Opium War. After the Opium War, the United States was shut out from China in doing business, and the United States turned to Japan and the Philippines. It should be noted that Anglo-American relations became friendly for the first time in the history by the visit of King George VI of the United Kingdom to New York in 1939, just before the Second World War. Thank you. Well, basically, what Japan has done since 1980s, where I was the, I think, budget examiner, who was basically in charge of the budget of the economic assistance to emerging countries, including China and India and also Africa. Our basic target, or I think our basic, objective was to raise the economic, living standard of those emerging countries to the level enjoyed by the Japanese public. And so we didn't care. We didn't care anything about our own interest. We try to work for the welfare of the global human being. That has not been changed even now. So Japan is always prepared to cooperate with China if Chinese side is actually forthcoming with the that kind of coordination with Japan. Yeah.
All right, so I think we're ready to go to questions, and I believe we have someone on the line. Let me just also say for both Harley and Mike, if there's anything that you have that you'd like to respond to, you can also choose to do that. Just as I think we'll just get ourselves started with the questions, and then in the course of things, if there's something that needs to be said. All right, go ahead. I think you're muted. No, can't hear you. No, we're still not getting any sound. You may want to try to figure it out, and we'll come back to you. Let me do the following while you're trying to figure it out. Harley, I don't know if there's anything, or Mike, that you'd like to add at this point while they're trying to work out that technical difficulty. Then if not, I have a. Okay,
I think we should just take questions.
Yeah. So here's what we have. I have something which I think we have a couple of posters. This is something that Glenn Greenwald had said a few days ago in an interview that he did with Matt Taibbi and Katie Halper. We wanted to get a response from you from. And Dave, I don't know if you can put that up, but I'll read it. This is a paraphrase. This isn't exact. This is from Glenn Greenwald. During the Trump years, American politics changed so radically because Trump became the singular and sole prism through which people evaluated where they resided politically. So that if Bill Kristol was opposed to Trump, it meant that Bill Kristol was your ally. No matter what else he might think, he was opposed to Trump, and that's all that matters. So there were this whole series of institutions: Wall Street, Silicon Valley, the CIA, the FBI, the NSA, the security state, that were deeply opposed to Trump. Russiagate came out of the CIA. All those guys like John Brennan and James Clapper and Michael Hayden were major denouncers of Trump. Robert Mueller, who was Bush's FBI director after 9/11, became a symbol of it as well. So it took all of these journalists whose principal job is supposed to be adversarial to these institutions, and it enmeshed them in these institutions because they looked at the CIA and FBI and Wall Street and Silicon Valley as their partners. And they were their partners. They were working together for a common cause, which was to destroy Trump. And those institutions were using these journalists to feed them the propaganda that they wanted disseminated. So, anyone like to comment on that?
Well, I can say something on that. I mean, I think what's interesting is if you look at the evolution of some journalists like Glenn Greenwald and uh, Mike mentioned Max Blumenthal, you have people who are considered left progressives who have been forced to rethink the whole political spectrum. And what Greenwald's essentially identifying is that left and right are fictional, Democrat and Republican. These are, it seems as though the United States is more polarized than ever and more partisan. But if you look at it, when the attack on Syria occurred just 2 nights ago, Republicans and Democrats almost unanimously lined up behind the attack. When Trump tried to pull troops out of Afghanistan and out of Syria, Democrats and Republicans lined up and opposed him. So what we're seeing is what should be a reshaping, a transformation of politics in the United States. But I think there's one thing that Greenwald and some of the others are missing, and in Greenwald's case, it's something that he probably does know because of the role of people like Luke Harding and others who played a leading role at The Guardian in running the whole Russiagate story, which is you can't look just at Brennan, Clapper, and these guys without starting with where did Russiagate become initiated from? It was Britain. It was the GCHQ. It was Christopher Steele. And not only that, Steele played a role going back to Ukraine in 2014. So you have to look at this bigger picture and then ask yourself, what do these people have in common? And they're committed to a protection of a bankrupt system in which they may profit personally, but it's their thinking, their view of man, which determines how they act. Think about Brennan meeting regularly with Obama on Tuesdays to map out who they were going to kill with drones in the Middle East, including, I think it's the figure is 60% of the deaths were civilians. So there has to be a open mind toward the political situation to recognize that there's a small group of people who represent neoliberalism and neoconservatism who are opposed to the tradition of the United States, but there's a potential broader alliance in the United States against this. And then if you go beyond that, that's what I was trying to get at, that Russia and China should be the greatest allies of American patriots in fighting against our nation's real enemies.
Okay. Helge, you have anything to add? Or should we go right back to the questions?
Well, that's why, I think we need this higher level of thinking, because if, since Trump was elected, you had, people in the Democratic Party who would stop thinking, it was like a red, a red cloth to a bull and vice versa. And I think we need really to completely conceptualize how the humanity as a whole gets out of this very, very dangerous confrontation.
Okay. So now I think the questioner has solved the problem. Is that true? Can we hear you now?
I hope so. Can I be heard now?
Yes, you can be.
Great. Okay, great. Thank you, everyone, for your wonderful presentation, especially Robinson. I think what that presentation in particular showed is how these, these big interests groups and all these different shadowy groups of people are out there doing their best to undermine the authority and the rule of Russia and China. And especially, since we've gotten the recent news of Biden launching the attack on Syria, it really shows that you can't trust the mainstream media, especially when they're trying to defend this as some kind of provocation against Iran, which I think is just completely ridiculous. So my question, it's very short. What's the antithesis then? Is talking about these different policies, talking about the different people that are involved in provoking Russia and China, is that the only solution that we have? Or is there something else that we can do to hold these people accountable and to expose them to the public? And what potential is there for restoring relations with Russia and China, given all that's going on?
Helga, I think it's probably yours.
Mike, you want, Mr. Robinson, you want to speak about that first?
Well, I think the UK. I think the point that the LaRouche movement has made over the years that there are no solutions in the UK is absolutely true. I mean, I look at the narratives from the British government about Russia, about China, and increasingly about China, and any people that are perceived to be would be political opponents of the current British government. For example, Nigel Farage, he's 100% on this anti-China narrative as well, and particularly since he came back from the United States. We went over to support Trump during the election. He's come back and he is pushing very hard an anti-China narrative. There has been a faction within the government of the UK which has the same faction that's been pushing the anti-Russia narrative, pushed very hard against Boris Johnson's attempts to maintain Huawei as a supplier for Britain's 5G network, and they ended up winning that fight. And as far as the general public's concerned, they are receiving so much propaganda from the mainstream press, particularly around Xinjiang and the Uyghurs, that this is a very difficult narrative to counter in this country at this point in time. And there are people attempting to counter that, but at this point there doesn't seem to be any political desire to offer any kind of positive narrative about Russia or China at the moment. So unfortunately, I'm not able to give any positive news as far as this side of the Atlantic is concerned.
Well, I'm a little bit more optimistic because, we are in contact with many people in many countries in actually all continents on the planet. And I have started an initiative to ask people who have personal direct knowledge, because they either do business in China or have worked there, to express themselves. And what Mr. Harley said is one example of that, because people who actually have been in China, or like myself, I was the first time there in 1971, and have seen firsthand what incredible changes to the better have occurred. But there are millions of people like that, because everybody who had to do with China says the same thing. So I'm actually quite confident that we can become the majority, and that will impact even the worst kind of lies coming from the integrity initiative or similar outfits elsewhere.
Yeah, Dennis, I would just say one thing on that. We just saw something this last week that happened in Texas, supposedly one of the richest states in the world, energy independent, the swaggering Texan mentality. I lived in Texas for many years and I know it quite well. But what happened? They made bad policy decisions. In 1995, they went with a major deregulation plan. In I think it was 2002, they launched a commitment to build windmills. And virtually every aspect of present economic policy, dominated by neoliberalism and the fake science of the Green New Deal, is going to bring about a collapse, a rapid collapse. We hear warnings of a potential hyperinflation. Now, at the same time, you have people who are looking at the last 4 years in the United States, and they saw there was a fight. Now, they may not understand the fight because the media is so dominant, and now we see social media and big tech censoring. But people are open for discussion, and especially when they see things like what happened in Texas, they ask themselves, how could this have happened? Now, our job is to be more bold than ever, and bold in not just talking to a lot of people, but raising questions that are not comfortable. For example, why do Americans fall for this anti-China stuff? For a while, everyone fell for the anti-Russia stuff because we had a Cold War, we had an intense operation against Trump, but people started figuring it out. Why are they falling for the China stuff? I mean, an element of this is probably anti-Chinese racism in a portion of the United States. But more importantly, what if people actually know, as Helga was just saying, what's going on in China? And we've got to be more aggressive and more bold in presenting the truth and challenging people to think on a higher level, not just to react by the old profiles. And I think that's the only way we can make a breakthrough. At the same time, working with potential allies around the world who already recognize that the Great Reset and the Green New Deal is going to destroy what's left of our economies.
I have a question that came in, which is sort of a follow-up to that, Harley. I mean, maybe we'll take it at this point. This is from Howard in New York. He says, I noticed that the speculative electricity company Griddy was shut down this week in Texas. Can there be changes by ERCOT and the governor of Texas to save the electricity system and also for the rest of the United States security of electricity supplies? And then, Helga, this one is direct. The request was for you to answer. This is from a professor in New Jersey who emailed this, and he said, imagine what we could have done with the $7 trillion spent on wars with respect to infrastructure and space exploration. Who should we be reaching out to, and what agencies should we reach out to address this in the public sphere? Okay, so maybe Harley, you want to go first, then Helga, you can take that.
Well, very simply, what did Franklin Roosevelt do when he was confronted with the problem of utility monopolies in the 1930s? He pushed through the Public Utility Holding Company Act, which regulated electricity. And we had regulated electricity for decades, just as we had regulated banking. And the neoliberal model that took off in the late 70s after Nixon took the dollar off gold and broke with the Bretton Woods Agreement, the whole speculative system, which is based on profit motive, short-term profit, just-in-time economy, and so on, is largely what happened with the deregulation, which hit California and Texas at the same time. It's not a coincidence that last summer California had blackouts during the heat, and now just last week Texas had blackouts during the cold. So you need to go back to regulation. And this is where you see the problem in the two parties. You don't have anyone who will fight for that because too many of them are on the payroll of lobbyists who are profiting from the deregulated economy. But that's going to collapse. So we have to put forward very clearly, like Lynn did, the fight for Glass-Steagall regulation of banking. We need a regulatory process for electricity as well. And the quicker we get something out there and move it, and then people contact their legislators, I think it's an open time now to do that.
Okay, and Helga, your question was actually, as he said, several trillions dollars spent on wars. What could we have done with that with respect to infrastructure and space exploration, and who should we try to reach out to?
Well, right now the financial oligarchy is planning to invest 30 to 50 trillion in the green reset. I mean, that will be a complete destruction of countries as industrial nations. So I think what we have to do is we have to get a mass movement of people who say these 30 to 50 trillion should be invested in infrastructure in the United States, but also, what I said about the reconstruction of Southwest Asia. I mean, the question is, what legacy does the United States and European nations want to leave to history? Do you want to be seen as the monster which, just went around with complete destruction? Or, I mean, why is China so much more attractive to the developing countries? Because, it's much better to get economic development than to be an aircraft carrier somewhere in the Pacific, because that's what, some of these military people think the Philippines should be, or some other countries. And I think, we should really get a movement of people who take an example. I mean, it may sound, really funny, but this woman from Abu Dhabi, I find her so inspirational. I mean, she she said the average age of the people who were on the Mars mission in in the Emirates is 27 years old. There were about, I think, 1,000 people altogether who worked on this project. And I think the only people who have a vision are people working in space. So we should talk to everybody who is working on the space mission. They should, talk to students, to professors, and we need an international cooperation, because once I'm getting this asked all the time. Why are you pushing this space question? What does this have to do with our problems here on Earth? And if you are facing the danger of nuclear war, why would thinking about Mars solve our problems? Well, it's an attitude, it's a mindset, because once you start to think about what are the really important issues, where does life come from? How does the human mind work? What is the relationship of the human mind to the development of the universe? Is the human mind part of this universe? Yes, this then brings up questions of why is it that ideas which are generated by the mind have an effect, so that you can send a rover, a lander, an orbiter all the way to Mars, and it follows your commands. That means, there has to be a correspondence between the laws of the mind and the laws of the universe, because otherwise you couldn't do it. It's what Schiller said in this beautiful poem about Columbus, that the idea corresponds to something in nature, and that the creativity is about getting an imagination of what that is and how it functions. And once you discover that, that's called scientific progress. So we have to get more people, who respond to these kinds of conceptions, and really start to overcome this geopolitics. It is much more exciting to get the first audio about wind from Mars. When I heard this in the radio, I got totally excited. I said, I hear wind for the first time from Mars. And that gives you an idea that we as a human species are just making the first baby steps, into discovering what is our identity in this incredibly large universe. And once people start to think that way, they don't think about squabbling, they forget about money. I mean, what is all these billionaires? Can they eat their banking notes? Sure, they can have a luxurious life and think they can live, outside of the corona pandemic, because they can shield themselves off. It gives you a certain cushion. But on the other side, if people think money is what makes you happy, I think Beethoven composed, that made him happy. Schiller, Keats, Shakespeare, they composed beautiful poetry, and that made them happy, and it makes us still happy. So I think we have to shift the identity of people, and we have to get people who really seek their pleasure and their happiness in creativity. And I think that the incredible convulsions going on means that this becomes more obvious to more people, and those we have to create together into a movement across all nations, because it's happening in Africa, it's happening in Latin America, and even in some European countries, people are waking up. So be confident and just join our movement, and we can do miracles together.
Okay, I think we're going back to the phones, and then we have one final question. So go ahead. We can hear you.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Is it me I'm on? Okay, great. Thank you. Yes, my name is Alvin. I'm here in New York, and my question is for Mr. Robinson. Well, your presentation was very powerful and explosive, and I can assure you it's going to shock many Americans. The LaRouche organization has long since championed the type of intelligence and journalism that you're providing. Now, you named characters and players, and you've exposed them greatly and lifted the veil. My question to you is, as you continue to investigate, to what extent are you able to identify or know of their masters, such as people like in the royal family, Prince Charles, Prince Philip, or those banksters in the city of London, whom they really seek to protect in their kind of digital geopolitical dangerous games that they're conducting worldwide?
It's interesting that at the moment Prince Philip is in hospital. He's meeting with Prince Charles. There's discussions going on apparently about the future of the royal family. There seems to be a bit of a changing of the guard at certain level within the royal family. So we now have a head of the British Civil Service who is from Prince William. He was previously working for Prince William, with Prince William. And we have the former head of MI5 now has become the Lord Chamberlain, who is responsible for managing the royal household. So there seems to be a new generation of people moving in, and they are very much from the same types of groups of people that I was talking about during the presentation. Now, it remains to be seen how that develops over the next several months and a couple of years, but the infrastructure that's being built around this, around the Foreign Office, around the Cabinet Office in particular in Britain, the Cabinet Office has effectively become the government, the Cabinet Office itself. The rest is superfluous. It's just for show because policy decisions are made there. So I don't know whether I'm answering your question, but it is possible to see the key people being placed in positions at the moment, and there's that. But that is a developing story, and we'll have to keep watching.
Maybe they shouldn't unpack.
Well, hopefully.
Thank you.
Okay, very good. And so Helga, this is a question which is directed to you, and it is this: how has Russia/China, how have Russia and China combated these aggressive media campaigns against them? It seems that they're often provoked to the point of war, but are very pacifist in their responses to the aggression. Is there a lesson that we can learn from that other countries can emulate?
Well, I think that the reactions are slightly different. I think what is characterizing the Russian response is you cannot understand anything the Russians do without taking into account the deep ingrainment of the memory of the Great Patriotic War, the 27 million people they lost, the absolute trauma of that war. And Russia wants never to have that war, but they're also more conscious about the danger of war, I think, than any other country I know of. So a lot of it is shaped by a wish to have war avoidance, but at the same time, an unshakable willingness to never give up Russia. And that is what is behind, an incredible amount of sacrifice over the decades, and a compassion to be technologically ahead in the military field. In the Soviet Union, this was the secret science cities. Now the Russians have, despite the fact that they only have a military budget, which is about 10% of that of the United States, they have developed weapons which in some areas are, for the moment, superior, like these hypersonic missiles, the nuclear-powered submarines. So I think that is one, metrics of response. China, I think, has a different one, and that is that the Chinese are so different than what they are being accused of. They have a history of at least 2,500 years of Confucian thinking, of never having the great warrior period again, of never having chaos again, a tremendous desire for harmony in the family, in the city, in the country, in the world. And that is why, despite all of these vicious attacks, China always comes back with an offer of cooperation. And, I think that is definitely something to learn from, because, the idea that you have to find a solution through a harmonious way of, taking care of the interests of all participants. I mean, that's very much similar to this idea of Nicolaus of Cues of the coincidentia of oppositorum. So I think what we could learn from both sides, but I think especially this idea of not reacting to provocation, this was also the method of Mahatma Gandhi, the non-violence, which did defeat the British Empire after all. Martin Luther King, who had also this idea of direct social action as a way to overcome conflict. And I think we have to find a solution through dialogue. I think we are in a period where any kind of, I'm going to knock you down, and this kind of knuckle-dragger mentality, I think this is barbarian. I think this is something to be overcome. I think it's an evolutionary, like a jump we have to make, to not think like a revanchist all the time and saying, you did this to me and I'm going to do this to you. I think this is such a low level of thinking that, I think we can learn a lot from the Chinese in this respect, because they are applying it. And, all great thinkers, by the way, you go to Plato, Augustinus, Cusanus, Leibniz, Lessing, Schiller. I mean, all great thinkers had this idea of finding a harmonious solution through dialogue, and were not these warriors. So I think, that it requires a different thinking, because, you cannot find peace without taking into account the interest of each participant. And that is a lesson one can learn.
All right, so we're basically at the conclusion today, and what we're going to do is just give everybody a chance to say whatever they would like to say in conclusion, or may have not said yet. So I think what we'll do is we'll start, Harley, with you.
Well, there's so much to say because there's so much going on, but I think to really hone it down to the point that Helga was just making, we have to find within ourselves the what Lincoln talked about, the higher angels of our being, where we do take into consideration the whole world. And one of the things that Lynn always talked about was you have to look at the world from the big picture. And that's how you avoid falling for provocations. That's how you avoid launching wars over false flags. That's how you avoid being manipulated into events like what happened on January 6th, which in my opinion was a setup or a sting against Donald Trump. So if you actually have this capability to step back and look at the whole picture, you'll begin to see the kinds of patterns that enable you to do the kind of research that Mike has done on this whole question of the integrity initiative and the manipulation of popular opinion. And we have to do the same thing with dissecting the social media. One of the things that really stuck with me was an interview with Ed Snowden, where he said, look, it's not just about getting you to buy things or for them to know your profile of purchases. And it's not just to find out who you're talking to and these kinds of things. It's to change the way you think. That's what social media is about. And if we understand that and then can operate from a level above that, then I think we can avoid the kinds of mindless polarization and partisanship and actually begin to find common purpose, even among people who have differences.
Okay, Mike?
I would just say, if I came across as being overly pessimistic a few minutes ago, it's not, of course, as bad as maybe I implied. I was talking about the political system. That doesn't mean that us as individuals can't, and as groups and as movements can't actually make a difference with respect to the integrity initiative. the tools were there through the Freedom of Information Act, through the various regulators actually challenging what they were doing and holding them to account meant they couldn't do it again, certainly not under that particular umbrella. So there are plenty of opportunities for people to get involved in stopping much of this policy agenda that we're seeing. And as you and Helga have said, in promoting a more positive way forward.
Okay, thanks a lot, Mike. Helga?
Well, I'm tremendously inspired by your report, Mr. Robinson, because when you put this out a while ago, we looked at it and there was this network of what they call influence clusters, and we have actually some names, in different countries. These are in part journalists or politicians, and you can see that this is like a spider web of people who are spreading the same kind of poison. So we will review that also in light of what you said, what this transformation was, because they have not stopped. They may have just changed their outer appearance, but I'm sure that they continue to do what they're doing. So thank you very much for your ideas. We will definitely look at the picture new, and that will, if you get more people to do that, it will help to defeat this bastards in the end.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we want to thank Mike Robinson, Harley Schleicher, and Schiller Institute founder Helga Sepp-LaRouche, as well as Mr. Sultan Ali, Mr. Tianjiao Zhang, and Mr. Daisuke Kotagawa for the presentations today. So we're at the conclusion of our broadcast. We just want to point out a couple of things. At the beginning of this broadcast, we heard Linda LaRouche say something about the secret, about the origin of the United States. It lies in over 2,500 years of history of the transatlantic and Mediterranean world. It comes from the history of China, 5,000 years. It comes from the Vedic history of India, which can arguably be traced back to the previous ice age. Why is that true? It's true because all great developments include all of the civilizations of the human race, because there's one human race, and that's what we're part of. When we talk about exceptionalism, the exceptionalism is that we can take exception to our bad behavior. We can decide to do something except decline and destroy our civilization. We have the ability to not be tragic, and that has too often, unfortunately, been exceptional. That is the way for Americans to think about the way in which they can consider a role in collaboration with other nations. And of course, it's possible to lead other nations in that collaboration and in correcting mistakes. And that may be the most important role that America today can play, and its citizens certainly can play with respect to the American presidency. But we want to just say that the idea of the coincidence of opposites, an idea that has been very characteristic of a particular effort that Helga Sepp-LaRouche has called for around the combating of the coronavirus, the distribution of the vaccines, and so on, and other healthcare measures, is something that is immediately actionable. And for more information on that, you can go to the Schiller Institute site and see what we want you to do there. If you like what you heard today, if you otherwise want to help, please circulate this presentation to everybody you know. You can also, of course, become a member of the Schiller Institute, which is an important thing to do. You can contribute both financially and otherwise, and you can just join our efforts directly. So on behalf of the Schiller Institute, we want to thank everybody for being with us today, and we hope that you can take this presentation and deploy it and organize with it in the spirit with which it has been presented. Thank you.